Hello, good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Nick Wallace. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Centre for Data Innovation, which is a public policy think tank that makes the case for policies that maximise the social and economic benefits of data. We work in Brussels here and in Washington DC, and we're also part of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which the University of Pennsylvania recently ranked as the world's #1 science and technology think tank. And our topic for today's event is what European policymakers should do to get more governments, more researchers and more businesses to share data and to open data so that others can reuse it. Now, the reason we think that's a goal worth pursuing is because from the reuse of data comes good things. For example, a lot of the navigation tools on our smartphones that we've all got used to relying on, which I know Andrus said she had trouble with this morning, they usually work. And a lot of them use open data from local governments and transport authorities and other organisations to plot routes and to plan journey times. And most of you probably already knew that, but what you might not realise is that the algorithms that power Google Translate were in part trained using documents published by the EU institutions, because the EU institutions publish documents in 25 languages, which is a great resource for a tool like that to improve its translations. And data from Copernicus, which is the EU's Earth observation satellite system, has been used to help farmers manage their crops and to become more efficient producers. I mean, it's used for a bunch of other things as well. That's one of the commercial uses of Copernicus data. But perhaps the most important area for data reuse is artificial intelligence. The development of AI depends partly on sufficient access to data, at least for the moment, because the principal technology driving advancement in AI today is machine learning. And machine learning works by recognizing subtle patterns in data, often extremely large quantities of data. And AI is going to be key to European competitiveness and European economic prosperity in the coming years. And if European policymakers want to influence the long-term development of AI, which I believe they do, to have an impact on the direction that advanced AI systems ultimately take, the best way for them to do that is to establish Europe as a leader in the field of AI and to empower European inventors and European businesses to create AI tools that the rest of the world wants to use. Doing that will give the EU a much louder voice when it comes to shaping the direction that AI takes in the future. So making sure that governments and researchers and businesses share as much data as they can, or as much as they can be reasonably expected to, is a good way to start supporting AI development in Europe. Now, some of you may know that last month the Commission published a package of measures geared towards doing precisely this. And in a moment I'm going to hand over to our keynote speaker, who will tell us exactly where the Commission's thinking is on this. He'll speak for 15-20 minutes, and then we'll go to our panel. There will be no speeches or presentations from the panelists, please. I will introduce everyone very quickly. I will break the ice with a few questions, and we will get straight into a conversation. The panel will talk for about 45 minutes, and then I will open up for questions from the audience for the last 15 minutes or so. And I've already promised that we will finish no later than 10:30, because I know everyone has places to go. We are filming this event on that little camera up there, and we will post it on YouTube and on our website afterwards. And of course you can feel free to tweet about this event with the hashtag Data Innovation. And I'm now going to hand over the podium to our keynote speaker. He's Jürgen Gren. He's a cabinet expert in the cabinet of Vice President Andrus Ansip. Please give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
So, thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. It's great to be here. I hope I will not speak for 20 minutes. That will be quite long, but maybe 10 minutes, 11. This is how I timed myself yesterday anyway, so let's see how it goes. So, as we've already said, in April 2018, just a couple of months ago, the Commission put forward a package of 3 different communications. One on artificial intelligence, one on the digital transformation of health and care, and another on the common European data space. These initiatives are strongly interlinked, as an EU-wide strategy on data is crucial in supporting the development of artificial intelligence as well as the digital transformation of the health and care systems. So it's all interlinked. Data has become an important factor, revolutionizing the economic sectors. This is far from a surprise. Everybody here knows perfectly well what this is about. Maybe just to give you a few figures. Some of our studies show that with the right policy choices and reasonably favorable economic conditions, the European data economy will grow from 2% of GDP to 4% of GDP by 2020. This is in euros. This is 300 billion a couple of years ago to 739 billion in 2020. If we look at PSI, public sector information alone, we have an economic value of about 52 billion euros today. But we think that this will grow to 194 billion euros in 2030. The EU data economy, just to give you a few examples of how important this data economy is, we talk about how revolutionizing it is, we talk about how different it will be for our lives, and we talk about how important it is in our economy. These different figures give you actually the feeling for how important it is in our economy. So the data economy employed around 6 million data professionals in 2016. And by 2020, we think this will increase to around 10 billion. There are around 250,000 companies doing this, and in a couple of years' time, we think that there will be 360,000 companies dealing with data and developing the data economy. But all of this will, of course, not work if we don't have supportive policies and legislation which are put in place, such as the ones that we presented in April. Our vision, as is expressed in the Digital Single Market Strategy, is that we need to put in place the right framework conditions at the EU level so that data is accessible and reusable. It needs to be accessible and reusable across borders for and by different types of organizations, private, public, research, but also for and by different economic sectors. This will permit Europe to have a large reservoir of different types of data, which will serve as a critical asset for the development of new technologies such as artificial intelligence or Internet of Things. Over the last decade or so, it has become very clear that the ability to combine public data, research data and business data, as was just said by Nick, is of crucial importance to respond to a variety of different challenges in innovation, research or environment. Our package from April, if I go to this one now, contains 3 different types of measures, each adapted to the data flows. First, we are talking about the revision of the directive on availability and reusability of data held by the public sector, the PSI directive. The Vice President whom I work for now refers to this as the Open Data Directive. It is a little bit more comprehensible and understandable than the PSI, and we will most probably change the name together with our friendly council and the Parliament. We have some representatives from the council here as well. So we will probably change the name together with our partners to make it a little bit more understandable, perhaps a little bit more populistic, but at least a little bit more understandable as well. The second part is instruments to improve the availability of data generated in the context of publicly funded research. And thirdly, guidance to foster data sharing and data trading among companies. And I would like to add also a 4th initiative to this, which was very recently, last week even, agreed with the European Parliament on the free flow of non-personal data, which is also extremely important now. We are covering, you would say, both personal data, free flow, and free flow of non-personal data as well. And we did it very fast, so great thanks to the European Parliament and the rapporteur who was able to help us to push this decision through on free flow of non-personal data. If I go back to each and every one of these different parts, just to give you an idea of what it actually brings. So public sector information can be used as a basis for a wide range of products and services. I give an example from the London Transport, for instance. They have liberated 200 different data sets So how many people are working on these data sets? You have 14,400 developers, 14,400 developers who work on this data sets. They are working with 600 applications, and they are generating 100 million in added value for London Transport. This is how important PSI can be. Public sector, the main changes proposed in our package are to enhance access to and reuse of real-time data, also known as dynamic data, and to limit the application of charges for reuse of data. The proposal also extends the scope of the directive to data held by para-public undertakings and to research data, and put in place measures that will avoid, we hope, data lock-in situations. We're also looking at the possibility to ensure free EU-wide access to high-value data sets. These are to be defined with the member state, but could concern data sets such as meteorological data or business registers. The proposal is now being discussed with the European Parliament and the Council. For the second part, granting access to scientific information holds important economic as well as societal benefits. For example, at the European Bioinformatics Institute in the UK generates a benefit of around 1.3 billion euros per year by making scientific information freely available to the global life science community. The EPRA package also concerns recommendations to member states on access to and preservation of scientific information. This includes guidance on how to work with text and data mining, or on how to implement open access policies in the member states. They're all very practical recommendations. On the private side, and now I come to the third part, there was no particular support for regulatory measures or interventions to promote data sharing in the private sector. We listened to these different voices, which told us that we do not want a regulatory intervention on the European side for liberating further private data. Therefore, we have published, again, quite concrete guidance on how to better share data in the business-to-business context and in the business-to-government context. This would be, for example, how to use model contracts and promoting the use of user-friendly APIs. And we would also like to see, at the same time, more development of data marketplaces. And as an example, a French company called Davex, with W, was founded in 2015. It does not purchase or sell data, but it brings together companies which are interested in monetizing and reusing data and conducting this transaction directly on the platform. We already support these types of platforms and other projects on the Horizon 2020 program. But these kind of efforts will be complemented with the support center for data sharing, which will be funded under the Connecting Europe facility and will be operational from next year and onwards. Ladies and gentlemen, a few weeks ago, we also proposed the first ever Digital Europe program. We think this is a robust investment program in digital transformation, and we want to invest 9.2 billion during the 2021-2027 budget framework. And this proposal, this budgetary proposal, aims to reinforce Europe's strategic digital capacities concerning 5 key areas: high-performance computing, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, digital skills, and ensuring a wide use of digital technologies across the economy and society. The availability of data is, of course, a precondition for the successful development of many of these areas. And funding opportunities relating to data are also included in the Commission's proposal for other financial programs, notably in the next framework program, Horizon Europe, so stay tuned to this. To conclude, we believe that we have laid the grounds for the digital single market, and in the digital single market, for a functional common European data space, benefiting both citizens and businesses across the European Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much for that. Just before I dive into the panel, 2 points. As I mentioned at the start, we're filming this, and I noticed yesterday that the camera was behaving strangely. I think the battery might be getting old. So those of you who are sitting behind it, if you notice the lights go out, please do panic. Thank you. Also, those of you who came in a little bit later, there is coffee, because that really will make you panic if you don't get coffee. There's a machine just in this little kitchen area here where you can get fresh coffee. Okay, great. So you already know who Jürgen is. I'll introduce our other panelists. From right to left, we have Andrus Navarro, who is the head of business development for Iberia and Latin America at Open Datasoft, which is an open data publishing company. We have Dinan Tinholt, who is the vice president and global EU lead. Global EU lead is a great title for Capgemini, and in particular at Capgemini he leads Capgemini's team on the European data portal. And we have Jérôme Urbain, who is associate partner at Dalberg Data Insights, which is an international development company. So obviously I've got my icebreaker questions, but as the panelists know, if anything interesting comes up, I'm not going to stick to them too rigidly. This is just a way to get people talking. But to kick us off, I'm going to start by saying that I'm going to start with open government data, or government data sharing, but I'm really thinking about open data in this question. Within the EU, there are some really big discrepancies between member states in terms of how much open data they publish. I'm glad to see that they've all been taken. There were a few of the reports that we published last year were laid out. I'm sorry they weren't enough for everyone as well, the ones I had left. Where we took data from the Open Data Barometer and the Open Knowledge Foundation on performance of EU member states and open data. And you've got a small number of countries, Britain, France, a couple of others, Spain, that do quite well. And then the rest are way down on the scoreboards. So I think my first question is, why is there so much discrepancy between European countries in how much open data they publish? And I'm going to start with Andrus, just because I know this is your area.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation, Nick. And from Open Datasoft, we're a French company, so we see a lot of what is happening in the French ecosystem, but we're present in 16 countries, so the UK, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, etc. So we have a broad idea of what is happening, and from my perspective, I think that the difference can come also because of the drive of these policies. So, for example, in Spain, I'm Mexican, so I'm going to relate to that. In Spain, there's a big drive against corruption and against conflict of interest. And I think that the open data movement in Latin America as a region has the same drive. So that when you put that into, or when you analyze how the open government data, let's say policies, move, I think that drive pushes them faster, because there's also like a societal pressure for it to happen. And then on other countries, I don't think that's the case for France, for example, for the open government data movement, nor the UK. There's more a drive for economic development. And for example, in France, if you compare the energy sector, so we're a data sharing platform, but not only for open data. So we also have a lot of clients on the private sector and energy transportation. And we see that there's a big push for innovation, for experimentation. You were saying that there's 14,000 developers working with the transportation data in London. And this idea of open innovation is that innovation will come from somebody outside of your company, that you cannot directly imagine what the potential of your data is, right? So there's a lot of energy companies that are putting their information out there without an enforcement or without a sanction. There's a law in France that pushes energy and transportation sector companies to open their data, but there's no sanction about it. But however, they're doing it voluntarily. And we see that a lot of them are they don't even know what's going to happen with their data. They're just putting it out there so that there can be some innovation coming from the ecosystem, and they're organizing hackathons, datathons, in the hope that there will be something happening from that. But we see it as a very early stage, and I think that regulation can take a big part of it, but also it's political will. And in the case of private companies, it is just the desire for innovation and the comprehension that putting the data out there will probably give their own company benefits, not even talking about the consumers' rights. In the case of energy, I think as consumers and as citizens, we have the right to know where the energy that we're consuming is coming from, and etc. So, I mean, there's different things that come into play, but regulation can be one of it. Political will in the case of governments, and in the case of private companies, it is this desire to push for innovation and things that people cannot imagine at this moment in their own companies.
Cool. Does anyone else on the panel want to add to that before I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Sorry, let me just...
I thought you were going to mention as one of the sources in terms of the maturity assessment. Actually, the maturity assessment done on the EU member states, that's available on the European data portal, because they actually do measure on a yearly basis what is the status in each country, and there's big diversities in terms of where they are in progress with regard to the technical side, the portal, the data sets, but also the strategy, the governance infrastructure, those sorts of things. And there is a big diversity in the amongst the countries, and that's often because of either capabilities, governance structure, how decentralized is it, and is it a political priority? Because sometimes it is used as, okay, we need to be transparent, we need to be public, so we'll open up some things, but that's it. In terms of we're doing it to look politically good instead of making as much available as possible. And maybe just to sort of provoke the debate a bit as well, we talk about all this prioritization in terms of what data should be made available, what categories do we need, but especially in fields where you need more machines to actually find the value in these data sets, I would say not just open it up as much as you can, but open it by default and only make a business case when you cannot open it up for security reasons, for privacy reasons and such. So turn the evidence around. You need to prove to me that you cannot make it available. Because what often do you see? And I blame myself as well, worked in the public sector many years ago, responsible for a lot of energy data and such. The data infrastructure was not mature enough to immediately publish it. So we're actually sort of using as an excuse privacy or security concerns or whatever, because and costs as well, because the infrastructure is immature, the processes are immature, and if you design it in such a way that you immediately make it available if you can, and then you can actually do it in real time and such, then you're organizing it properly, and especially with more real-time data, that's necessary as well.
Judy.
Yes, thank you very much. From our side, I mean, this is you're right that there are different diverging strategies or differences between member states, and this also comes from different governmental strategies, of course, whether they have refinancing obligations and what have you. But from our perspective, and this is also, quite honestly, of course, why we are working on the PSI, and we have been doing it for quite some time. We've been revising this directive several times, so this is the reason, of course, that we want to go forward. But for us, we're talking here about three, four different dimensions. What we want to do is to try to harmonize the conditions around reuse and try to converge as much as possible the different policies, and we're doing this to overcome the different barriers in the digital single market. This is what we're doing. And at the end of the day, this will also create, we hope, a certain amount of peer pressure, which will then, in the end, liberate or open up much more data. And I was also very interested in saying, in hearing what you said about that the private companies are now understanding perhaps a little better that the interest that they have themselves to put data out there, to open up more data sets for the use of things that they don't necessarily know exactly for what purpose. And doing this through, you didn't mention it, but I think it is important also to mention that we can stimulate the companies to do this through very user-friendly application programming interfaces, because otherwise there is no access, or easy access. I mean, everybody uses APIs to get access to data, but the more they are user-friendly, and standardized, the better it is for the smaller and medium-sized centres. But I'm sure we come back to that later. But these are the different dimensions from our perspective.
Right. I mean, as you pointed out, the EU legislation sets the rules on reuse. It doesn't say. I mean, I know the new proposal does actually have some obligation to publish some types of data under certain conditions, but as a general rule, the PSI directive is, that's the Public Sector Information Directive, it's not an open data directive because it doesn't say you have to publish the data. It says when you publish the data, you're not allowed to use, you can't type it in licensing terms. You have to let anyone use the data. So I think the root of my previous question was really how do we get to how do we create the conditions that Andrus described? Because I recognise the point you make that there are different priorities in different countries when it comes to why open data by default becomes a theme. In some cases it's corruption, in other cases it's more about economic efficiency or making government leaner, which was certainly the argument in Britain. So I think my question, and I'm going to give this straight back to Jürgen, is what can the EU do to get more member states to do that? I mean, I'm not suggesting that it would have to be something regulatory. I'm saying what can Brussels do to persuade more of the European capitals to adopt laws like the open by default law that the UK has for its national institutions?
I mean, as we said before, it shows that the peer pressure does work. The fact that the member states are sitting together, it does work. I mean, as far as we can see, I wouldn't be so negative because it seems to us anyway that open by default is more or less the rule in the member states today. In most member states, there are several different, as we said before, diverging views and divergent governmental strategies, of course. But we think and hope that the whole package that we came forward with in April will enable, of course, the member states to open up more data for reuse. This is for us, it's not the first step, it's one of the different steps that we are taking. We're also working with them, of course, in a variety of different projects, research projects, etc., that also enable this kind of policies going forward. The recommendation on scientific data, for instance, also recommends to have open data policy in the research area. In the PSI, we also put down an obligation to have open data policies inside the different countries to enable these different data. So we are doing quite a lot to help the member states to move forward on this particular thing.
Yeah, I agree with most of the things that have been said so far, but I think it's very hard to find data as well, and so we need to centralize it in some way. As was already said, we need to encourage people to share data for sure, but if it's impossible to find it, or if it's done at small scale, then it's not efficient. So it's nice to have a policy, but we need to have a whole framework in place to be sure that people can find data, can know what data people hold and public institutions hold. And so, yeah, we need to encourage that and make sure companies have to tell what kind of data they hold. There is a marketplace for people to meet, and so between data holders and data processors to meet and know what kind of data is available. And as Dylan was saying, public institutions should prove why they don't release data and not the other way around.
So with regard to finding, some of you might have noticed that in my opening remarks I was kind of blurry about the distinction between open data and data sharing. That was deliberate to an extent because I mean one of the drivers of open data sometimes is data sharing. So particularly in the British case, and especially in local government, one of the arguments that's used in favour of open by default is that it makes it easier for different parts of government to share information. They're so bad at sharing data with each other that if they just stick it all on the internet, they all know where to find it. And that sometimes seems to happen when you usually have some kind of big personality in local government. Like, I'm not going to name any specific people, but if you look at a lot of the kind of big, successful open data portals in some countries, there's often some kind of, not a tyrant, but someone who's come in local government and said, right, this is what we're doing, and if this isn't, and anyone who doesn't like it can leave. So I think there seems to be a kind of a bottom-up element to that. I mean, especially in cities where you've got smart city projects. So I think I'm going to put another question to Achilles, because Open Datasoft and also its competitors, because there are other companies working in this space too, does a lot of work with local governments because local data has obvious value for the kinds of reuses I mentioned at the beginning, like your app, which I think probably works most of the time. So how much of the momentum for open data and for data sharing do you think needs to come from that kind of scenario that I described as local initiatives, rather than from the top down? Or is that perhaps leaving too much to fortune, and do we need regulatory action from either from the capitals or from Brussels?
Well, I think,
Well, I think a lot can come from the local level. Unfortunately, then you're relying on political will entirely. So it's kind of tricky because there's some regions and or some cities that have, for different reasons, they can have political drive to be the first ones in the country, and because they want to participate in this international challenge, or they want to be the first ones in the index, or because they have a very high economic development in the region or in the city. So we see that this can be a big driver. We also see very small towns. We have a client of 4,000 inhabitants, and in the open data world we call it the open data heroes. There's one open data hero that started publishing data, and this little town, there's not a lot of open data demand, but you have a hero there that is really interested. So you can have different drivers for that, but I would say that at the local level, that is where citizens can really see what open data is, because if you open information about transportation, how are we going to tell citizens what open data is? It's a very abstract transparency, and open data, it's a very abstract concept to explain to citizens the importance. So you can tell them how open data can impact their lives if they see it every day, like in the transportation sector. Or, for example, in France, there's also data that is released by some cities about what they call the cantine, like the lunches that are served at schools, so that parents can see what their kids are eating, and etc. So I think that the open data policies at the local level can have a bigger impact in the citizens' idea and in the citizens' perspective, let's say. Also because of all of the smart city policies and programs are normally implemented at local level. So all of the IoT data can also be released at a city level, and so we think that that's a very important thing. And just to connect it with your previous question, I think that this peer pressure that Jürgen was mentioning is very relevant. And there's a program that is called EU Digital Cities Challenge. I think programs like this, and maybe peering a very advanced region in one country with a less advanced city in another country, could be a very good thing, because then you could push for a faster development of the open data policy from a city that is right now figuring out what they have to do and they don't really have any idea. If you have them working with somebody that has already put it in place, and that tells them, look, you can make these shortcuts, and I think that could be a good thing that the EU could enhance.
Okay. But can I just intervene in this field, because I think we're getting a bit into, we're talking about open data, these civic moves, bottom up, and that's all good. But it still feels a bit like we're talking about a civic movement, something which we should do, it's good and everything. But come on, this is business, this is money, this is data. Now do you think in oil-producing countries they're debating, should we extract this oil or not? Do you think it's useful? No, they're pumping it out as much as they can and of course regulating it in terms of influencing prices. But in a digital economy, this is the crucial things. Taking another perspective, we're all living in democracies. We all think that the government should account for how they spend the money. Okay, great. So we're already paying for this data. So we think it's normal that governments account for how they spend money, but we don't think it's normal yet that they open up everything they have. I think it should become the new normal, because apart from these transport apps, which are nice and everything, and which we use, but it's also about the big, old-fashioned, traditional businesses. Banks, insurance companies, car manufacturers, they are all dying for this data, whether it's in the field of risk management for insurance firms, whether it's in the form of smart cars for car manufacturers. These big firms want this data, but it's not enough out there yet. And especially with self-learning algorithms and such, it's not a question of let's prioritize which data sets. No, make everything available all the time, even going back 100 years or so. Then you can get the value from it, because sometimes these algorithms need 100 data sets to see which is the most valuable. So when we take it outside of the civic action movement and into business as usual, you have to make it open and make a business case. When you don't, then it's really going to make progress. And that's actually why from the Commission side, I think the PSI directive, it's often not promoted as a popular directive, but I think it's a crucial one, a very important one in this digital age. And I think it should be pushed much and much more.
Couldn't agree more. Of course. Push our proposals, make sure that they are known, of course. But as I said, I mean, we are taking this step by step, right? You understand this. I mean, we started with the PSI directive in 2003, we have revised it already once, we're revising now again. We are including now research data, and as I mentioned, there's an obligation for open data policies when it comes to publicly funded research data, which is put into the directive, which I already explained. So, I mean, we are taking this step by step, and we have now opened up to public undertakings as well, a certain number of obligations in terms of non-discrimination, transparency, and non-exclusivity. So I mean, we are taking this step by step, of course. So I think we are getting there. And what I would say is that it's not just. I mean, we call it civic movement. I wouldn't call it this. I mean, civic movements are incredibly important, but this is business today. So I would disagree that it is kind of minimized or reduced to some kind of civic movement. It's not at all. I think what is important as well is to come out with all of these good examples of what you can actually gain from liberating your data, because people, and this is not just about public sector, this is holding on to hoarding the data. This is about the private sector as well, and they're very much hoarding the data because they are not quite sure what will happen if they do liberate, and they're not quite sure if they put out these different plugins in form of APIs, how the different smaller companies can access data behind this API, whether it is security, etc., these kind of risks. So I think going out there, and I really would like you to push the PSI, because it is actually a major step forward. It is a major step forward. Let's not sort of reduce this. But also at the same time to help the companies to understand that if they liberate up this data, they can create whole ecosystems around themselves. A few examples: we have been working with, the payment services directives open up, for instance, access to bank accounts. And in certain countries, I'm Swedish, and I'm speaking a little bit to Swedish banks. They say that, no, this is fantastic. We have been able to create a whole ecosystem, small financial services ecosystem, around this possibility to open up the data and use APIs with the bank accounts and give access to that. And we are sitting there, we are becoming platforms for all of these financial ecosystems. And they gave me an interesting example, which was that there's a company now getting access to all of the bank customers, millions of them, to be able to provide services of how to better handle and manage your private economy. And I gave an example of, for instance, I have, not me, but this person had apparently 2 gym subscriptions. And this little company actually was able to help me to manage this much better and get rid of one of these gym subscriptions. It's on this level. I mean, these different examples are important. And the better we can get it out there, the better we have data being freed up. We had also a meeting between the Vice President Ansip and the whole insurance sector where he made this point very strongly. The insurance sector has a lot of data that they can free up and potentially create ecosystems around the data that they have, non-sensible data, sensitive data that they have. So this is, I think, are the ways forward, and I think definitely that we are doing our part here. I would definitely contest anybody saying we're not.
So I'm going to ask one final question on government data, and then I'm going to move on to business data. But Dinan's point about that basically you're saying we need open data by default, and that's certainly where these questions are aiming. And I don't think anyone on the panel would disagree. I think the question is, how do we herd all of the cats to that goal? The cats being the EU member states as well as their local governments. And Heather's gave the example of how, in Spain, corruption was one of the drivers for open data. But the fact is though Spain perhaps has more problems with corruption than some European countries, it has considerably less corruption than many others. It's not so corrupt that an initiative like that could get derailed by malign interests, which unfortunately is not necessarily the case in all European countries. So, and I'm going to tie this to a point that Jürgen made much earlier when you said that the portals need to be user-friendly. It needs to be something that people actually want to look at and use. Because we already have a rule where all procurement contracts in the EU have to be published in the official journal of the European Union. And public procurement is a huge area where corruption can be a problem, including in Europe. And the fact of those contracts going into the OJEU doesn't stop that happening. It doesn't prevent kickbacks. So would a way of perhaps updating that portal, perhaps on a European data portal style outlet, making it a bit less clunky than anyone who's ever looked at the OJEU, it's not very easy to read or to use. Would something like that help us move more in an open data by default direction? Because this is something that the EU has competency in, that the EU can regulate by saying you have to open up your procurement information. I mean, perhaps you could spend a bit of time telling us what the European Data Portal is and whether you think it could support something like that.
Yeah, because you made the comment earlier, can you find all of this data? And actually, yes, you can. It's just europeandataportal.eu, which actually harvests all of the metadata from all of the national open data portals, 34 countries, 24 languages. And at the moment, it's like 850,000 data sets out there. So that's a lot that you can already access. Cool thing as well is, the multilingual search part. Now that sounds like a fancy thing, but the thing is you can actually then compare data sets across different countries, across different languages, and find it from different geographies. Who would want that, you say? Insurance companies, car manufacturers. We speaking to the big OEMs as well. They love this kind of data and that they can compare it and such. So they don't need to go to 10 different places to get it, but they just go to the European Data Portal to access it there. So I think that's one of the strengths as well. And now the collaboration with, let's say, the European Open Science Cloud in terms of how can that be combined? Questions about what do you do with Copernicus data in the future and such. So those are the growth aspects. And what the European Data Portal does is actually three things. One is, apart from making all that data available, and hopefully after today you'll go there to look it up. But also supporting member states and actually opening up much more of this data, which is on skills side, which is on the strategic side, which is on the governance side, and also I would say the engaging with the whole ecosystem in terms of the reuse. How can we get different sectors to actually reuse much more of this data? So those are the three pillars where activities taking place. And to respond to Jürgen's comments, yes, I think at the EU level, the EU is definitely doing its part in encouraging open data and such. The big step now is for the member states, and this is at national, regional, and local level, because the governance structure in each country differs very much. And you're not, even at the national level, you're not talking about one ministry that you have to talk to. You're talking about many agencies that have to open this up. And I think the peer pressure is an important one. You might even actually promote sort of a data accountability. Are you opening up your data? In other words, if you ask society for data, businesses, citizens, and everything, I want you to be held accountable in terms of how much are you opening up. And if you show this data accountability, that's not just the peer pressure at the European level, but the peer pressure towards your citizens and your businesses. How much can you reuse there? And I think that's there's a lot of potential in that field. And I think that will help opening up much more. And by the way, as you get increasing amounts of services offered around this and such, it'll become sort of the new normal that yes, it will be open unless. And people using it. Now, whether I'm using it to actually already pay out money to farmers who have a risk insurance because I already see that they're going to that they deserve a certain fee because there was a flooding or something, or whether it's when I'm buying a house and I can see what kind of environment it is, or anything on bank data. I think that's where the real potential is.
Yeah.
So now you know where to go to actually get all that central data.
Yeah, thanks for that. I actually went to the portal, and what I believe is that what is under is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, yeah.
So I believe there is so much more that's not under, and it's not the fault of people maintaining the portal. It's just like there is unknown data sets and people don't make it public. So that's one thing. Yet there's still a huge lot of data sets under, and I believe it's sometimes hard to find your way in that. And if I come back to old times, you would look for some book, go to the library, and you would be able to ask the librarian for advice and guide you and tell you where to find something that relates to what you're looking for. And so I'm wondering whether there could be some kind of services like that, you know, that you can address to specialists who know exactly what data is available and could guide you and help you find that data. Because otherwise, I mean, we're a small group in Brussels, 10 people. We don't have resources to spend days, you know, looking for data, to contact, 20 different agencies, governments, etc., to know what is available. And so if we could have that help to say, okay, yeah, we're looking for the data, asking someone to say, yeah, actually you can go to those people, public or private. I know that they have that and they can help you. So that's maybe a difficulty for me when I went to look at the portal.
Where does Dalberg get its data from? Maybe it would be helpful if you explain, first of all, what Dalberg's using its data for, because I'm assuming most people here probably don't know what Dalberg Data Insights is. They may have heard of the Dalberg Consulting Group. But secondly, I mean, where you get the data from, because I know you're not just using public sector data, right? You're using private sector data as well.
Yes, and so one part of the tricks here is that we're mainly using data from outside Europe. So I'm no expert in using European data. We had a few projects with European data, but we're mainly using data for development. So mainly in developing countries. And we do get private data, mostly telecom operators' data, which is very sensitive, private, and at individual level. And that's always hard to get, and there are reasons why. Privacy is one of them. But what we do generally is that we bring our algorithms to the data, so we do not transfer data to Brussels. We actually keep data there and we do all computations there. And so several sectors we are active in is financial inclusion, so trying to make sure everyone, even in developing countries, has access to basic financial services, which in some countries go through telecom operators. We have public health projects, tracking mobility from mobile phones and joining that with public data sets about diseases, incidents, to know what are the risks of epidemics to spread. We have projects on smart cities trying to improve transportation infrastructure. We have projects on agriculture, also using satellite imagery to try to predict crops, yields, etc. So that's basically what we do. Again, mainly outside of Europe, and telecom data is a big source of information for us.
Okay, so now we're getting into the second half of what I want. I'm sorry that we won't have time to go through research data, but we're getting into business data where in many cases we're no longer necessarily talking about open data. I mean, we might be in some context, but in some contexts we're going to be talking about sharing, because there are privacy issues, as you mentioned, if you're dealing with data that identifies people. There are also competition issues if you're dealing with, with data that is part of a company considers to be part of its competitive advantage. You force it to open the data, and it no longer sees the data in that way. It'll stop collecting it, or it might stop collecting it depending on what it's doing with it. So we're dealing with something a bit more complex here, and so I'm going to go to Andrus again, because I know that one thing that makes Open Datasoft different from some of the other companies working in this space is, whereas the others tend to focus on government, and you do too, but in addition to working with government, you also work with businesses, and you don't just publish data. You, as I understand it, you have some contracts where you're basically setting up closed internal data sharing portals within companies, and I don't know whether you're doing it between companies yet. But my question is, what makes private companies want to share their data with others or even publish it? I know there's not many doing that, but I understand from my conversations with your colleagues that you do have a few contracts like that. So what drives them to do that, and what kind of companies are they? And what are the incentives, and perhaps how could policymakers alter those incentives to encourage companies to publish more?
Yes, so just to clarify, we are a cloud-based platform for data sharing. So, and yes, as you said, Nick, we have half of our clients are public sector and the other half are private, mainly energy, transportation, and now we have new sectors. We have construction, we're going into banking as well, etc. So what are the drivers? Well, for the private companies, in the energy and transportation sector, I would say that, well, without having the exact number, but I would say that probably of their usage of the platform, they would have 10% of their data open, and the rest would be like internal data sharing. So it can be either within the company, because they have, let's say, non-expert data users that need to share data. I will give you an example. For the railway company in France, they started making an internal use for the maintenance of the railways. So they have a big team in the whole country, and they needed to see what railways needed to have maintenance, and which teams had already done their job, and these people are not data experts. So they needed a very user-friendly data sharing platform to, like, for the maintenance group in the whole country to be able to visually see what has been done in the works, and that is an internal use. So we're able to do like subdomains. So the railways company has a public use of data, let's say released to users, and yeah, so about the hours that the trains arrive, so that if everybody has the sense that the trains are late, well, you can actually see that there, and you can analyze, you can make your graphs, and then they have the like two internal uses of the platform. So the drivers can be either breaking silos inside within the companies, because big companies can have like very different teams from different directorates that don't necessarily communicate with each other. So that can actually, like an internal data sharing platform can help them to access data from other sides of the company and to push for internal innovation. Other cases, we see that they actually want to share data with their clients. So specifically energy companies, they use a platform to show governments, so city governments, their energy consumption. So that can be a big driver as well, like making a data product that can add a value of their service. So probably their service is not related to data, but the fact that they, for example, they can compete in a smart city tender and say, well, out of everything that you're asking of me, on top of that, I'm giving you like a dashboard that where you will be able to analyze all of this data without having to have a group of experts within your government, etc. So it can be breaking silos, it can be specific business cases or business uses within or inside the company. It can be creating an added value to be able to compete for public tenders. So those are, I would say that would be the first three drivers for private companies to share data. And what are the incentives that could be, or that could be enhanced? I would say, well, I would insist in regulation, even if it doesn't have a sanction. I do see that in the case of France, the law that was passed in 2016, it really pushed for for companies to start putting data out there. And I see the comparison with other countries, and you go to energy companies and they're like, why would I have to share my data? Like, why do I want to put my data out there? And you tell them, well, you know, your neighbor country, all of the energy companies in your neighbor country are doing it, and they just don't see it. They don't see a reason for it. So I would say regulation could be a first step.
So what was in that French law?
Well, it says that public interest data, especially transportation and energy, they have to, there's a big recommendation for them to open data about their performance, at least. So you see a lot of these energy companies publishing information about the production and the consumption of energy, and you can analyze it by region, but what kind of energy, if it's from renewables or not. And we also have clients that are working with this data to help governments plan in the long term. They're regional governments. So it's called Acajul. It's a company that is using this energy data that is out there at the moment, and they process it and they analyze it, and they help regional governments say, well, in 10 years I'm going to have this need for energy, so I have this potential in solar energy or this potential in this other kind of it, and they help governments plan their energy strategy, let's say, at the mid and long term, with the information that is publicly available, and of course with their added value of their company and their predictive analysis.
So this sounds a little bit like, this being the French law, the proposal on public undertakings in the update to the PSI directive. I mean, Jürgen, do you want to explain what's going on there?
Well, I mean, as I said before, we have expanded a little bit the scope of the PSI to also cover public undertakings. And what we're asking them to do is, of course, to share as much data.
What's a public undertaking, just so that everybody understands?
Oh my God, the definition is, well, this is about public utilities, basically. That's what it's about, water, energy, and these kind of companies, public transport. But what we're asking them to do, we are taking this step by step, as I said before. So what we are saying is that when you do liberate and free up data, you have to follow three different dimensions, which is about the transparency, about, as I said before, a non-exclusivity and non-discrimination. These are the different rules that apply to that data that they will then free up. And what is important here is, of course, to see that we have a sort of a harmonized approach to the data when it gets freed up. So there's transparency about what the cost basis is. There's transparency about what kind of formats which are being liberated. There's non-discrimination, so which means that you can use the data across different sectors for different purposes, and also non-exclusivity, so you don't have this different lock-ins, so that everybody is the possibility to access this data. So this accessibility part is very important for us.
So there's, I'm going to go to Dinon because there's a small leap from public undertakings to public-private partnerships. And I mean, I know that in your career you've done work on smart city projects, right? Mm-hmm. One of the headaches that sometimes comes up when it comes to investment in smart city projects is you've got local governments that want private investment, and you've got would-be private investors who want to monetize the data from those investments, from census, for example, and then government's going, well, hang on, this is a public project. You can't, you can't turn that data into a private asset. This is going to be a public good. And then the company says, well, how are we going to get our money back then? Why would we invest in the first place? And often nothing happens because, of course, the local governments don't have the money for these investments. So what do you think could be the role in public-private partnerships like that to either to open up more data that's not necessarily explicitly government data, or to just at least lead to more of that data being shared in a way that it gets reused for socially useful purposes? And you can stick with the smart city example if you like, but I think that's probably the most obvious case of it.
Yeah, I think, first of all, if you look at this question, one is there's an underlying assumption amongst many businesses as well that a lot of the data that they have is rivalrous data. In other words, it's stuff that they can monetize. It's stuff that's either competitive or that they could sell. But if you really look at the details, a lot of the data isn't. Many of the cases is a small part is competitive or rivalrous, a big part isn't. So I think first it's good to make that distinction. At the same time, we do have to recognize businesses are in business to make money. If you recognize that, they're not an alternative form of taxes. They're in it to make money. So if you recognize that and see how could they do that, or at least, let's say, decrease their costs, then you're at least accepting them for what they are. Let's make a very silly example. Now, if I'm a business, and now I don't think that art on the wall here is very expensive art, but let's say these are all Rembrandts and Van Goghs, and I'm a business. If I donate that art to a museum, that's tax deductible. So I basically earn less taxes. But if I give away a lot of the data that I have in a form, I don't get anything in return. Why is that? Is it because data can be copied, or because we think art's more important than data? So if you see, let's say that difference, an interesting thing is there are many ways that you can make it valuable. Even citizens these days are becoming data producers. Businesses are data producers and such. And I think there are benefits that you can create. So whether it's tax breaks or such, or sometimes it's whether to give them a unique advantage in specific field, or become a preferred supplier for things. Recognize that they're in the business for the money part. Then you can actually become partners and say, well, how can I help you? We as government would like to have services which benefits the citizens. You as a business need to either want to pay less taxes or make more money or get better access or be able to offer additional services and such. Then you can have a bit of reciprocity in that field. Another thing, there's two other aspects to answer this question is, if you look at the data sharing, oftentimes what we say as well is we're hesitant to open up the data because it could be rivalrous. And even in the cases where it is competitive or privacy sensitive data, there's developments now where you can have sort of synthetic data sharing. So instead of making the data available, I'm making the output of the data analysis available. So I'll have it either within my company or on a secure platform. You can run the algorithm, you'll get the feedback of the algorithm. I won't open up the data, but I'll still give you the outcome you want. So that's a way to overcome privacy issues, to overcome competitive issues and such. And on the B2B or even the B2G sharing and such, also interesting is that when we want to find money, there's the financial institutions where we can actually go find money on the market. Borrow money from banks or from private investors. If I want to buy a company, I can go to a stock exchange and buy a share in a company. If I want to see is certain data available, is there, I would say, almost like a data stock exchange. Now there's many private data marketplaces that sell you the data, but there's no place where I can go to, hey, I'm an insurance company. I would like specific automotive data for all of these European countries. Is there anyone out there who could sell that to me? Now, apart from, let's say, one-on-one exchange, that doesn't exist. Wouldn't it be interesting as well to see if you can sort of set up a data marketplace as well for B2B and B2G data sharing?
But this is exactly what we try to push as well, and we are supporting this in our Rise in 2020, for instance. We will support it further as we go forward with the next program. So yes, definitely agree with you. This should be developed. Maybe just a few words on the B2B or B2G business government sharing as well. On the B2B, as I said in my speech, we had long discussions with the private sector, and it was quite clear that it was premature to come out with these different laws or regulations on how private businesses should share their data. It was a little bit premature. This was a very clear signal that we received. So what we thought would be useful at this stage was to come up with guidance, very practical guidance on how you can work with the different contracts, how you work with transparency and the conditions and the purposes of the use of the data, and how you can set up the sharing of the value. So it's very concrete in our business-to-business guidance that we published in April, so everybody can use it straight off the shelf, as you will. But there's also another part which is about the business-to-government sharing of data. And here, just to give you an example, I'm sure you already know about this, but just to give you an example, we have been discussing a lot with transport companies, and one in particular that the Vice President uses as an example quite often is Scania, which is a Swedish truck manufacturer. And they collect data from all the different connected trucks that they have, and they collect data on road conditions, they collect data on weather conditions, and things, which is completely, shall we say, non-sensitive data, and data which can be shared quite easily with other companies, but also in particular with the government. Just one example, I mean, how interesting wouldn't it be for, say, the Swedish state or the German, for that matter, to receive direct information on the road conditions so that they can better plan the interventions on repairs, for instance. This costs billions. Anybody who's been driving through Germany knows how this is expensive, and it's all over the place. So this is something which is of course very useful as we see it, and we'd like to promote this. For now, we do not have any plans on regulating this, but we'd like to promote it.
In an example, is Scania willing to do that?
The answer is yes. We have been speaking to them, and they are definitely willing, and I think they are doing it already, to be honest. They are already sharing this with smaller businesses, as I understand it, but of course you have to ask them. I'm not an expert on exactly what Scania does, but they're already sharing this with smaller businesses, I understand it, and I always stand ready, as we understand it, to share this quite freely with the public sector as well.
If I can add something.
We also see there's a partnership that Waze has been doing with the governments. So what they do is they share the data of the real-time traffic to cities, and in exchange they ask for the road works planning. So what they want is to be able to feed their users by saying, like, don't use this road that you normally would use, because from this date to this date there's going to be works. Now the problem is that they share the data, but they share a file that then cities can not visualize. So we are the intermediate partner, so that when this partnership is done, so that governments can actually visualize the data in real time even. But I also, to add on that, we have seen some open innovation programs between cities. In the case of Paris, it's been the third year that they do a data city open innovation program that has worked quite well. So what they do is the city at first they asked in a public tender, I believe, for an intermediary to connect big companies. So it can be energy companies. There's also telecom companies, construction, transportation. To connect with startups, to be able to accelerate open innovation, let's say, programs for these companies to use their data for some social or economic improvement in the city, for energy efficiency as well. And we're also a technological partner there, and we've seen how this program is a good way. If you don't make let's say an enforceable regulation, it's a good way to enhance big companies to actually start to experiment with data and to find a business case and to find an economic value to their data that can be used also for the city itself. in some cases. In others, it's just for internal purposes of the company. So that kind of programs can be a good alternative to enhance the use of data to try to identify economic value for internal open innovation programs for these companies.
So just to try and find a takeaway, particularly from this private data discussion, I was chastised by the moderator for saying this on a panel at the UN, but today I'm the moderator. Can we infer from this that data is not the new oil? Because it's not a zero-sum game. I profit from it doesn't mean you can't use the data that I use, and that we need to think about it, in a competitive sense. We need to think about data differently from how we think about oil. I'm going to start with Dinan, because I know that you drew this comparison earlier about Saudi Arabia, and actually there are economic incentives for them to sometimes leave the oil on the ground, but that there is an important distinction here in terms of, while data may be fueling a new type of economy, the way in which it's used isn't meaningfully different, and we need to get away from this metaphor. That is a leading question, I know.
So I'll disagree with you. So is it the new oil? Yes, because even in your phrasing, it's fueling it. Now the fact that oil is a zero-sum game and data isn't. That doesn't imply that it's not the fuel of the future. Maybe let's not talk about oil, but let's say the fuel of the economy and such. But it is crucial there. And actually, I like the examples given. For example, what you were talking about ways. Indeed, it's not only that the government has to provide an incentive, which can be a tax break and everything, but they can also provide access to data, earlier access to data and such. And government can almost become a co-producer in certain private services by making things available or easily available. Yeah, and it's a free exchange there. But actually, I wanted to pose the question. So, should we change the paradigm? No, we shouldn't change the paradigm. But it is such, and we have already paid for it. So, whether it's public data, which has already been paid for by the taxpayers and such, it should be made available by default and reverse the burden of proof. That part. So, not say why you will make it available, but why not if you can. And then on from the business side and such. Give those incentives. Recognize the fact that you're asking businesses to provide something which is costing them something. They produce it and such, and that can be financial or data or something else. I know that banks, for example, have to provide a lot of data to the government about some of their economic activities and such, and they happily do so as long as they can get the data in return from all of the other banks, and not the privacy. They happily, if it's at a higher level without specific specificities on which bank it's coming from, that's fine for them. But that allows them to benchmark each other and such. And actually that's why I wanted to ask you, because you do a lot of work in certain developing countries and such, but especially getting information from telcos. What are the things that, when you talk with telcos, why are they giving it? And what are the kind of conversations you have that motivates them to open it up for you?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it relates to some of the examples that have been given. So it's hard to get data. Why do they give it to us? Because we use it for public good, and we still like to do that.
So that's gonna look good.
Yeah, it looks good. Yeah, sometimes there is a monetary value. So sometimes we pay for the data. So that's another motivation. But we have had cases where even though you could see they were really willing to be involved in those public good projects. It was like, I can't give you that because it's too competitive. And as you said, if all companies release that data, then they could be fine. But if they're the only one to release data that could be accessed by somebody else, even through the UN agency that we give it to, that could reveal their market share in several places in the country. They're like, okay, no way we do that. And so again, in the French law you mentioned, it's like they force everyone to release, they force every energy company to release data. And so, any company is at the same level. But then if it's only one, then it's really difficult, and you need to show them the value. We need to prove them that there will be no leak, that, as I said, we do all computations within their premises, so they still control the data. They have a view on what will be outputted and to whom it will be given. And so that's what we do to reassure them, but it's pretty hard to to get them to share the data, and even more when it's just one company and it's not a regulation that is forcing everybody to do so.
So there are more questions I want to ask, but I promised everyone we'd finish at 10:30, so I'm going to open up for the last 15 minutes for questions from the audience. If anybody has a question, if not, I have more. Yes?
Yes, hello, Agatha Paglia from Fleischmann. I just was wondering, Jordan, what do you think is going to be the process in the Parliament and the Council on the PSI? Is that going to be easy? Is smooth, discussion? Do you think that it might be adopted by June 2019?
Just for the benefit of the camera, the question was, is the PSI directive going to be a smooth process in Parliament and Council, or are we going to see trouble when it hits the legislature?
And if I can ask a second question, so you said that the industry was now not ready and said that it was premature to legislate on B2B sharing. Do you think that that might be a topic for the next Commission?
I can't answer the second part, as I have no idea. There will be a new mandate from next year, so let's see what priorities the President of that Commission and that Commission will take. But on the first, I mean, that we always have the hope of trying to, rather the hope, I would say that the Council has clearly, the European Council has clearly stated that all the different digital single market proposals should be ready by the end of this mandate. And this is a very clearly stated political objective by the Council, by the heads of state and government. And of course the Council and the Parliament, I mean the Council is bound to a certain extent by this, of course. The European Parliament also have a great interest, obviously, to try to finalise the digital single market proposals as fast as possible. I can't predict, obviously, today exactly how smooth this would be or not. We have just recently learned about the rapporteur, who's a Cypriot, as I understand it, from GUE, and we have just started to make the first presentations in the different council working groups. So, of course, the different member states are listening carefully, and then we have to discuss further. But I also know that the Austrian presidency would like to move forward on this dossier. So our goal is and has always been, to ensure that all of the digital single market proposals are done within the mandate that we have. And we will continue to try to get there.
A bit of a social philosophy question in that data production is intellectual property, and intellectual property is an asset. It takes money to create an asset, and so to incentivize a company to share its assets, many times, from the examples that you're talking about, it's a type of preferential treatment for a company that has had more resources to develop its intellectual property. So how do we match social need versus protection of intellectual property versus open data sharing so that everyone can benefit?
So can I ask, when you say data production, so you're not making the claim that all data a company collects is intellectual property?
No, but
Right.
for example, Google with its autonomous cars.
Yeah.
If you go to Mountain View, it's difficult to get into this very intersanctum where they have collected this type of data. Of course, they're using public data, and they also share data because roads need to be closed or other types of benefits need to be given to Uber or Google or whoever is developing autonomous cars, or you could extrapolate that to other AI types of functions. But it seems to me that that gives preferential treatment to companies that have had resources to develop this type of very potent IP intellectual property. I think that's more a government question than anything.
So
sorry.
So one thing that just came to mind is actually in privacy law, is if you look at how the Article 29 Working Party has interpreted the right to data portability, the distinction is between inferred and observed data. In other words, if the data subject has the right to the observed data, that's the raw data that the company collects about them, they don't have the right to the inferred data because that's intellectual property, and the right to data portability doesn't trump the right to IP. Is there some way that principle could maybe help us in your example, that there's a distinction between, although the problem is obviously collecting raw data itself is
right,
quite costly.
Exactly. And so, you know, as governments develop relationships with companies that can produce data that they might need for smart cities or IoT or whatever social function has been designated as a desired goal, strategy, how do other companies which aren't privileged in terms of resources to develop this data, whether it's inferred or open, whatever, it seems that we're creating a hierarchy.
Well, government, you said, yes. But we are the European Union and the European Commission, so it's not really government. But maybe if I answer the question, try to answer the question in a sort of more general way. It's obvious that the collection capacity differs from different companies. It's obvious. Is that a reason to not have open data policies? Not so certain. These kind of data will also serve for a whole, as I said before, a whole ecosystem of smaller companies that also can use the data and build different businesses on top of it. And this has been shown in a variety of different examples I just gave. The London public transport data is not just given, I mean it has actually impacted 14,000 something like this developers, which are not cool, as an example. And then I would like to revert a little bit to the second part of the question on the social benefits or social needs. And I would say that the part of our proposal which goes into trying to foster and promote a little bit more the sharing of data between businesses and government goes very much into that area, because at the end of the day, if you have a lot of data which is being made available, and there's also a lot of different services and a lot of information and understanding of different needs from population, epidemics, for instance, if you talk about health, where the main areas of social needs are, where the main areas of crime are, for instance, and all these kind of things are very important for the public sector to understand. And this can then help them to address the different social needs. But I would say that generally speaking, data sharing will, at the end of the day, also produce these kind of services which will help people. That's, for me, I have a very strong conviction that it can be said.
Maybe even slightly build on that, because I understand the question, but I disagree that there's, by definition, a certain hierarchy. I mean, there's also a level of innovation that you can say, well, you can change the whole paradigm in terms of who fulfills what role. Practical example, we can have a form of almost a data civic volunteerism or something, which you get some benefit in advance, whether it's a tax thing or whatever. Practically, taxi drivers in certain cities, I forget which city, but taxi drivers, when they install certain sensors in the cars and such, and they say, well, okay, we'll install that sensor, dear government, and we'll send the data to you, because they do that for the same thing, Jürgen, you were mentioning on, let's say, checking the road quality and such, and traffic conditions. So they say, well, I'm a taxi driver, but suddenly I'm also a data producer for the government. There's nothing extra that I do, just somebody's installed a tiny chip somewhere and it transmits the data, and suddenly I'm getting some benefits. Now, if you come up with an innovative proposal like that, suddenly you can become a co-producer with the government, and you don't need to have I would say, an established position like Google or Amazon or whatever. And that kind of innovation, I think, is very much what we're looking for in this data economy as well.
There is a company that does exactly that, but I've forgotten what they're called. But they do it all over the world, and they sort of find what incentives to put sensors like that into various different types of vehicles, postal vehicles, taxis, buses, all of this, to share the data. But their name has slipped from my mind, but I'm sorry. I don't have a system for taking questions, so I'm basically going in the order in which people manage to catch my eye. The lady over here was the first.
Thank you. My name is Laure Wagner. I work for Vodafone, and I want to give an answer to one of the questions you've asked each other on the panel, and the question briefly. Why do telco operators share data? So we have three principles which we look at when this question arises. One, Of course, data sharing needs to be legally compliant, and here, obviously privacy and protection of personal data is a big one. The data we have is our customers' data, and so of course we owe it to respect that fully. So very often what we do share is not the data itself, but it's insights based on those data, pseudonymized data, for instance, which leads us into other discussions currently in legislation, meaning privacy. Second principle. It needs to be socially acceptable, so there's a whole lot of ethical questions, which is why we do a lot of big data for social good, using our mobile data, which is what you said. And the third element is it needs to be economically viable. So of course we are not, philanthropy, or and that links up with I think what you said about the potential incentives and reason. And the question flowing from that for me would probably be. You mentioned the French law and the forced opening of business data. What have been the impact in terms of competitiveness on maybe the economic sector or those companies flowing from that? And that's one question, and we're also doing quite a lot of work on B2B non-personal data sharing, and on why there, because we see a lot of opportunities in that area, and a lot of the obstacles we seem to see are indeed legal, contractual, cultural as well, technical. So there's a strong interoperability question as well, and then of course security. So that's just to sort of feed into the discussion. But I think it's I think there's generally a lot of opportunities if all those boxes can be ticked.
Well, I think that we're at a very early stage of this publication of data, and I think, well, from what I see, I think that there's no impact at the moment in terms of competition, because also there's different actors in the end, especially in the energy sector. There's different actors, and their roles are very different, and they can actually benefit from having information from the other company in order to improve their own processes, I guess, no, like eventually. So we see, for example, there's one of the projects, and they have opened information about an aeolic park. And they literally said, we don't know what's going to come out of this, but we want to experiment. We want to open this information. This information is not, we're not obliged to publish it, but we're just doing it and let's see what happens. No, we hope that there's going to be researchers out there that can come and tell us, or data scientists that can come and tell us, you can improve here and here because we analyze your data, So we actually see it as a positive competition and as a positive ecosystem, and we're even organizing, since we are the actor that is common to all of them in sharing their data, we're organizing like small and private events to put them all in contact so that they can tell each other like what they're doing with their data internally and etc. So I don't see it as a negative point. I see it more like we can be an actor that can put them all together to give themselves or to give ideas amongst themselves of what to do with the data.
It's 10:30 and I promised that would end. So if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, sorry about that, but by all means hang around. I'll be here for at least another 15 minutes packing up, so if you want to come over and chat, feel free. If any of the panelists want to hang around, that's fine. But I promise we'd end now and we'll go. So thank you very much for coming.